The chamber doors slid apart with a sound like restrained thunder, and Elias Wren felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders as he stepped forward. Pale stone walls rose around him in clean geometric planes, reflecting light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At the far end stood the alien Empress, her silver-blue skin luminous beneath layered armor etched with symbols he did not yet understand. Her eyes were fixed on him, sharp and cold, and the court behind her had fallen into a silence so complete he could hear his own breathing. Elias had been summoned without explanation, pulled from his quarters by silent guards who would not meet his gaze. He told himself this was another negotiation, another cultural misunderstanding to be bridged with patience and care. Still, the tension in the air felt different, charged, as if something fragile hovered on the edge of breaking. He stopped where the floor markings indicated, heart pounding but posture steady. Whatever this was, he would face it as a human representative should. The Empress did not speak at first, and the delay stretched until Elias wondered if it was deliberate. Light shifted across her features, catching on the smooth curve of her cheek and the intricate lines of her ceremonial collar. When she finally moved, it was a single step forward, metal plates whispering against each other with controlled precision. Elias felt the attention of unseen observers press in on him, alien minds measuring every breath and twitch. He remembered his training, the countless simulations where remaining calm had been the difference between peace and catastrophe. Yet this was no simulation, and the fury in her gaze was unmistakable, held back by discipline alone. He sensed that whatever grievance she carried was not trivial, not something to be dismissed with protocol. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, grounding himself in the physical reality of the moment. He met her eyes, refusing to look away, a small act of defiance he hoped would read as honesty. The silence broke at last, and her voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Her words came in a tone that vibrated through the stone beneath his feet, translated seamlessly by the implant at his ear. She accused, demanded, questioned, each sentence layered with emotion that went far beyond anger alone. Elias felt himself reeling as he absorbed the meaning, not because the words were incomprehensible, but because of the weight behind them. She spoke of betrayal, of expectations unmet, of a trust extended too far and now strained to its limit. The Empress's voice carried centuries of authority, yet beneath it Elias heard something raw, almost personal. This was not just politics, not just a matter of treaties and borders, but something that touched her pride and perhaps her hope. He realized then that he stood not merely as a diplomat, but as a symbol of his entire species in her eyes. Every human action, every promise made and broken, converged on him in this instant. His mouth went dry as he considered how easily a wrong response could shatter the fragile peace they had built. Still, he listened without interruption, letting her finish, honoring the gravity of her words. As she spoke, images surfaced in Elias's mind of the months that had led to this point. The first contact mission had been cautious, almost tentative, humanity stepping into the wider galaxy with equal parts curiosity and fear. The Empress's people had been among the first to extend a hand, intrigued by human adaptability and emotional nuance. Elias had believed then that mutual respect would be enough, that understanding could be forged through dialogue alone. Now, standing before her fury, he saw how naive that belief had been. Cultures did not meet as equals by default, they collided, carrying histories and wounds that could not be wished away. He wondered which incident had ignited this confrontation, which report or rumor had twisted into perceived insult. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he held on to the one thing he knew for certain. Humanity's strength had never been perfection, but persistence, the willingness to confront mistakes and learn from them. He straightened slightly, preparing to answer when the moment came. The Empress fell silent again, her gaze searching his face as if weighing his worth. Elias felt exposed, stripped of rank and title, reduced to a single human heart beating in an alien court. He thought of Earth, of blue skies and crowded streets, of the countless people who would never know how close their future hovered to disaster in this distant hall. The responsibility was staggering, yet it also clarified his purpose with sudden sharpness. He did not need to dominate or outmaneuver her, he needed to be truthful, even if that truth was uncomfortable. He took a slow breath, steadying the tremor in his chest, and inclined his head in a gesture of respect. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, carrying across the chamber without strain. He acknowledged her anger without defensiveness, admitted that humans were still learning the consequences of their reach. The words felt inadequate even as he said them, but they were sincere, and sincerity was a language he hoped transcended species. As Elias spoke, he sensed a shift, subtle but real, in the atmosphere of the room. The Empress's posture eased by a fraction, the tension in her shoulders changing from coiled fury to something more controlled. He realized then that her summons had not been solely to condemn him, but to test him, to see if humanity's reputation for resilience and empathy held true under pressure. The realization did not erase his fear, but it gave him direction. He spoke of human history, not as a triumphal march, but as a series of hard lessons learned through failure and perseverance. He spoke of mistakes made in ignorance and the determination to repair what could be repaired. He did not ask for forgiveness outright, knowing it was not his to claim, but he offered accountability. Each sentence felt like walking a narrow bridge, yet he sensed that retreat would be more dangerous than honesty. The Empress listened, unreadable, and the court remained silent, waiting. When he finished, the quiet that followed was heavier than before, filled with unspoken possibilities. Elias felt the echo of his own words lingering in the chamber, fragile and exposed. He wondered if he had said too much or not enough, if his appeal would resonate or be dismissed as weakness. The Empress regarded him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting a complexity he had not expected. Beneath the anger, he glimpsed calculation, curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of respect. She moved again, descending from her dais until she stood only a few steps away from him. The proximity was intimidating, yet it also felt strangely intimate, as if the vast gulf between their species had narrowed for an instant. Elias held his ground, trusting that whatever came next would be shaped by the choices he had already made. He braced himself for judgment, knowing that this encounter would define far more than his own fate. The Empress spoke once more, her voice lower now, the fury tempered but not gone. She told him that words alone could not mend what had been strained, that trust, once tested, demanded proof rather than promises. Elias felt a spark of understanding ignite despite his nerves, because proof was something humans understood well. It was in their nature to act, to build, to endure, even when the odds were unforgiving. He nodded, accepting the unspoken challenge embedded in her statement. Around them, the court seemed to lean in, sensing that the moment had shifted from accusation to possibility. Elias did not know what form this proof would take, only that it would require sacrifice and resolve. Yet as fear mingled with determination in his chest, he felt something else rise alongside it. A quiet conviction that humanity's greatest strength was not in its technology or numbers, but in its refusal to give up on understanding, even when faced with alien fury. The Empress's final words lingered as Elias remained standing where she left him, the court slowly exhaling around their shared silence. Guards shifted with restrained motions, and distant mechanisms hummed within the palace walls. Elias understood he had not been dismissed by accident, but granted time to absorb the weight of her challenge. Proof was demanded, not persuasion, and that meant action under conditions she would define. He felt the familiar human impulse to plan, to outline steps and contingencies, but forced himself to wait. Alien courts valued restraint as much as decisiveness. He watched as the Empress turned away, her back straight, authority undiminished, and realized the test had already begun. What he did next, even in stillness, would be judged. He centered his breathing and waited. The summons came not through words but through motion, a subtle gesture from the Empress's aide directing Elias to follow. They passed through corridors carved with geometric precision, pale surfaces reflecting their movement in fractured reflections. Elias walked alone between two guards, their steps synchronized, their faces unreadable. He wondered whether this journey was meant to intimidate or prepare him, or perhaps both. The air felt cooler here, carrying a faint metallic scent that reminded him of ship hulls and long voyages. He thought of humanity's early days in space, of fragile vessels held together by hope and calculation. Those memories steadied him. If humans could cross the void with nothing but determination and math, they could endure this trial too. He lifted his gaze and kept walking forward without hesitation. They entered a chamber unlike the grand court, smaller and dimmer, lit by narrow shafts of light from above. At its center stood a projection table alive with shifting symbols and star maps. The Empress waited there, armor set aside, her presence no less commanding without it. She motioned for the guards to withdraw, leaving the two of them alone. The intimacy of the space unsettled Elias more than the crowd had, because now there were no witnesses to temper the truth. The Empress regarded him closely, her expression unreadable, then gestured toward the projection. Elias stepped nearer, recognizing trade routes, contested systems, and markers that pulsed with warning hues. This, he realized, was the heart of her fury. The proof she demanded was already taking shape before him. She explained without ceremony that a destabilizing force was moving through the border regions, disrupting alliances and exploiting misunderstandings between species. Her people had believed humanity would act as a stabilizing presence, a bridge rather than a spark. Instead, human traders and explorers had unknowingly amplified tensions, their adaptability misread as opportunism. Elias listened, absorbing each detail, feeling the familiar sting of unintended consequences. Humanity had always learned fastest through mistakes, but here the cost was measured in lives and worlds. The Empress's voice held no accusation now, only grim clarity. She needed someone who could move through chaos without escalating it further. Someone willing to step into danger not as a conqueror, but as a mediator under fire. Elias understood then why she had chosen him. His reputation for patience was now his burden to bear. The task she set before him was simple in description and daunting in reality. He was to travel to a contested system where tensions were nearing open conflict and demonstrate humanity's commitment to balance. Not with force, but with presence, negotiation, and if necessary, personal risk. Elias felt the weight of that responsibility settle into his bones. He would be exposed, vulnerable, a single human amid volatile factions who distrusted one another. Yet he felt a spark of resolve ignite alongside his fear. Humans had always excelled when placed between impossible choices, finding paths where none seemed to exist. He agreed without bargaining, knowing hesitation would read as weakness. The Empress studied him for a moment longer, then inclined her head in what he recognized as acknowledgement. The trial was set, and there would be no turning back. Preparation was swift and minimal, another deliberate choice. Elias was given a small vessel, advanced yet stripped of overt weaponry, emphasizing intent over threat. As he boarded, he felt a familiar mixture of excitement and dread that accompanied every leap into the unknown. The Empress's aide briefed him on the factions involved, their grievances layered and complex, but Elias focused less on the details and more on the human approach he would bring. Listening first, speaking second, acting only when necessary. The vessel's engines hummed to life, and as the palace receded into the distance, Elias allowed himself a moment of reflection. Humanity's strength was not in certainty, but in the willingness to move forward without it. He set his course toward the contested system, knowing the journey itself was part of the proof demanded. The stars stretched into lines as the ship entered faster-than-light travel, and Elias felt the familiar disorientation wash over him. Alone in the cockpit, he reviewed the Empress's words again, parsing tone as much as content. Her fury had masked fear, not for herself, but for the fragile balance she guarded. Elias realized that, in this way, they were not so different. Leaders across species carried the same burden of protecting futures they might never see. The thought grounded him, turning anxiety into purpose. He practiced possible conversations aloud, adjusting phrasing, imagining responses shaped by alien logic. It was a human habit, this rehearsal, born from the understanding that preparation was a form of respect. When the ship dropped back into normal space, he felt ready, though he knew readiness was never complete. The contested system greeted him with signs of strain visible even from a distance. Traffic patterns were erratic, signals overlapping and conflicting, as if the system itself were arguing with itself. Elias slowed his approach, broadcasting open channels and neutral identifiers. Responses came slowly, suspicious, layered with coded warnings. He recognized the fear beneath the bluster, the same fear humans had once felt when strangers appeared unannounced in their skies. He adjusted his posture, his tone, projecting calm through every available medium. When permission was finally granted to dock at a shared station, he felt a small victory take shape. It was not peace, but it was a beginning. He reminded himself that beginnings were often the hardest part. With a steady breath, he guided his vessel into the station's embrace. The station was a patchwork of architectures, each section reflecting the culture that built it. Elias walked through corridors where gravity shifted subtly, lighting changed hue, and ambient sounds layered into a constant hum. He felt out of place, conspicuously human, but he did not retreat inward. Instead, he observed, noting how beings moved, how they avoided or acknowledged one another. These details would matter. The first meeting was tense, representatives gathering with visible suspicion, their attention fixed on Elias as the newcomer. He introduced himself simply, without embellishment, acknowledging the strain in the room rather than ignoring it. His honesty seemed to disarm some, unsettle others, but it kept the conversation from collapsing outright. He sensed that every word mattered here, each syllable a potential pivot. Negotiations stretched on, exhausting and slow, punctuated by moments where conflict nearly flared. Elias relied on empathy as much as logic, reflecting concerns back to those who voiced them, refusing to assign blame. It was a risky strategy, one that left him exposed to criticism from all sides. Yet he noticed subtle shifts, shoulders easing, tones softening, as participants realized they were being heard. Humanity's adaptability showed not as dominance, but as flexibility, a willingness to change approach in real time. Elias felt drained yet focused, driven by the knowledge that failure here would echo far beyond this station. When the meeting finally adjourned, nothing was resolved, but nothing had exploded either. In this context, that was progress. He allowed himself a brief, quiet relief before preparing for what would come next. That night cycle, alarms shattered the fragile calm. A skirmish erupted in the outer sectors, a misinterpreted maneuver escalating into open hostility. Elias was awakened by the station's emergency systems, his heart racing as he absorbed the reports. This was the moment the Empress had warned him about, where words alone would not suffice. He moved quickly, coordinating with station control, placing himself in the open channels between the factions involved. His voice carried urgency without accusation, urging restraint while offering himself as intermediary. It was dangerous, reckless even, but he knew distance would be read as indifference. As weapons powered down and ships hesitated, he felt the tension crest and then, slowly, recede. The proof demanded was being written in real time, with his presence as the ink. In the aftermath, Elias stood alone in the quiet that followed, hands trembling slightly as adrenaline faded. He had not solved the conflict, but he had prevented it from spiraling beyond control. He sent a detailed report back to the Empress, outlining actions taken and risks accepted. As he waited for her response, he looked out at the stars beyond the station's viewport. Humanity's path among them would never be easy, he knew that now with clarity. Yet he also felt a growing confidence that humans belonged here, not as conquerors, but as connectors. When the reply finally came, brief and measured, he allowed himself a small, exhausted smile. The trial was not over, but the proof had begun. The response from the Empress arrived without ceremony, a concise transmission that acknowledged receipt and nothing more, yet Elias felt its weight all the same. He stood by the viewport longer than necessary, watching distant stars drift as station traffic normalized, each restored routine a fragile stitch in a torn fabric. The calm felt provisional, like a held breath, and he knew better than to mistake it for victory. Proof, as the Empress had said, was not a moment but a pattern. He turned back to his console, reviewing sensor logs and comm transcripts, searching for the subtle signals that precede larger ruptures. The factions had pulled back, but resentment lingered in coded silences and delayed acknowledgments. Elias understood that the true work would happen in these margins, where trust either regrew or calcified into grievance. He prepared messages tailored to each group, careful with tone, deliberate with timing. Humans survived by learning to read what was not said, and hear that skill mattered more than any technology. He requested meetings not in council chambers but in shared spaces, places where representatives could not hide behind formality. The first was with a traitor coalition whose routes had been disrupted by fear-driven patrols. Elias listened as they vented frustration, their voices edged with accusation and exhaustion. He did not correct them when they misattributed causes, instead asking questions that led them to articulate their own uncertainties. It was a slow unwinding, tension easing as they realized he was not there to assign blame. He offered practical adjustments, human ships volunteering to act as neutral escorts along contested lanes, absorbing risk to reduce friction. The proposal was met with skepticism, then cautious interest. Elias could feel the calculus shifting, fear weighed against the unexpected willingness of humans to place themselves between danger and profit. He left the meeting drained but encouraged, aware that small concessions could yield outsized trust if honored consistently. The second meeting was harder, held with a militant faction whose pride had been wounded by recent setbacks. Their leader spoke in clipped phrases, posture rigid, eyes never leaving Elias's face. Here, empathy alone would not suffice. Elias acknowledged their losses directly, naming them without euphemism, and accepted responsibility for humanity's role in exacerbating tensions. The admission landed heavily, creating a pause thick with surprise. He followed it by outlining a joint monitoring effort, transparent and time-bound, designed to prevent further misunderstandings without ceding sovereignty. The leader listened, expression unreadable, then asked a single question about enforcement. Elias answered honestly, admitting limits and emphasizing accountability through shared oversight rather than force. It was a risky stance, one that could be dismissed as weakness. Instead, the leader nodded slowly, conceding nothing yet rejecting escalation. Elias recognized the moment for what it was. A door cracked open rather than slammed shut. As negotiations continued, Elias felt the strain accumulate, a constant hum beneath his thoughts. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by alerts and recalculations. He reminded himself that fatigue was not failure, that endurance was as much a human advantage as ingenuity. During brief respites, he recorded personal notes, reflections on tone and timing, small insights that might matter later. He thought often of the Empress, imagining her receiving his reports, measuring progress against expectations shaped by centuries of rule. He wondered whether she saw in him a mirror of her own burdens, or merely a useful instrument. The uncertainty did not paralyze him. Instead, it sharpened his focus. Humans had long learned to operate without full knowledge, making decisions under imperfect conditions and owning the consequences. That habit now carried the weight of interstellar peace. The turning point came unexpectedly, sparked by a misfired warning system that triggered a cascade of defensive responses. Elias was in transit between meetings when the station lurched, alarms blaring in overlapping frequencies. His console flooded with contradictory data, ships powering weapons in reflexive fear. He acted before fear could metastasize, broadcasting a clear, calm directive on all channels, identifying the fault and requesting a temporary stand-down. The request alone would not suffice, so he authorized human vessels to reposition visibly between the most volatile groups, shields active but weapons cold. It was a calculated gamble, exposing human ships to potential fire in order to buy time. Elias felt his pulse hammer as seconds stretched, each one a test of whether trust built over days could withstand panic. Gradually, weapons powered down, responses slowed, and the cascade halted. The system stabilized, leaving behind a stunned quiet and the realization that something fundamental had shifted. In the aftermath, representatives sought Elias out rather than avoiding him. Questions came, not accusations, probing the logic behind his decisions. He answered openly, emphasizing the cost humans were willing to bear to prevent escalation. The message resonated because it was backed by visible risk already taken. Word spread through informal channels, stories evolving as they traveled, casting humans not as opportunists but as stabilizers who absorbed danger rather than deflected it. Elias knew narratives mattered, sometimes more than facts, and he did not rush to correct embellishments that reinforced restraint. He focused instead on codifying the gains, formalizing protocols while goodwill remained fresh. It was unglamorous work, dense with clauses and contingencies, but it translated emotion into structure, making peace durable rather than performative. When the Empress finally responded again, it was with an invitation rather than a command. She requested a live debrief, her tone measured, curiosity threaded through authority. Elias felt a flicker of relief tempered by apprehension as he prepared the connection. He reviewed footage and logs, selecting moments that illustrated choices rather than outcomes. When her image resolved on the display, he noted the absence of armor, the setting less formal than before. He spoke plainly, recounting decisions and their costs, highlighting where humans had chosen exposure over dominance. He did not frame the results as triumphs, instead emphasizing fragility and the need for sustained effort. The Empress listened without interruption, her gaze intent, and when she spoke, her words surprised him. She acknowledged not just success but restraint, noting that fury had given way to assessment because humanity had proven capable of self-limitation. Elias felt the weight in his chest ease slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. She warned him that this was only the midpoint, that deeper forces watched and learned, adapting to new patterns. Elias accepted the warning, understanding that stability invited tests as surely as chaos did. He committed to remaining in the system longer than planned, extending human presence to reinforce the emerging norms. The Empress inclined her head, a gesture that carried more meaning than any proclamation. As the connection ended, Elias leaned back, exhaustion washing over him in waves. He allowed himself a brief moment of stillness, acknowledging both the progress made and the long road ahead. Humanity's proof was being written line by line, choice by choice. The decision to remain in the system altered the rhythm of Elias's days, stretching them into a continuous thread of vigilance and response. He adjusted to the station's cycles, learning when corridors grew quiet and when tensions resurfaced in subtle ways. The longer he stayed, the more he sensed currents beneath the apparent calm, conversations that paused when he approached, alliances recalibrating in private. He did not push for access, trusting that presence itself carried weight. Human crews rotated through escort duties, their routines becoming familiar to other species, predictability easing fear more effectively than speeches ever could. Elias made a point of walking the station regularly, visible and unguarded, exchanging brief acknowledgments with beings who had once viewed him with suspicion. Each nod, each shared silence, stitched another small thread into a fragile tapestry of trust. He understood that endurance was not passive, but an active choice to remain exposed. This was the cost of being taken seriously among powers older and more patient than humanity. The first true test of that endurance came when a distant outpost went dark without warning. Reports were fragmentary, signals cut mid-transmission, speculation flaring almost instantly. Rumors spread faster than verified data, and fear rushed in to fill the gaps. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest as factions began to mobilize, interpreting the silence as provocation. He requested time, urging restraint while human sensors triangulated the last known position. The request was met with grudging compliance, thin patience stretched taut. As data streamed in, a picture formed of sabotage rather than accident, deliberate and calculated. Someone wanted escalation, wanted the system to fracture along its fault lines. Elias recognized the pattern with a chill, the hand of an unseen instigator exploiting mistrust. He knew then that the Empress's warning had arrived sooner than expected. Confronting an enemy without a face demanded a different approach. Elias convened an emergency council, not to assign blame, but to share information transparently. He laid out what was known and what remained uncertain, resisting the urge to fill gaps with speculation. The choice was risky, exposing vulnerabilities that could be exploited, but secrecy would only fuel paranoia. Representatives reacted with visible unease, some bristling at the admission of ignorance. Elias held his ground, emphasizing that unity against manipulation required shared clarity. He proposed a joint investigative task force, composed of volunteers from each faction, operating under agreed constraints. The suggestion sparked debate, old rivalries surfacing in sharp exchanges. Elias listened, intervening only to redirect focus toward the unseen adversary. Slowly, resistance softened, replaced by wary agreement. The task force was formed, its very existence a statement against fragmentation. As the investigation progressed, evidence pointed toward a nomadic group operating beyond formal alliances, profiting from destabilization. They were skilled, patient, adept at vanishing before retaliation could coalesce. Elias felt frustration simmer beneath his calm, knowing how easily such actors could unravel months of progress. He coordinated with human analysts and alien counterparts, mapping patterns, anticipating moves. The work was meticulous, demanding attention to detail and trust in others' expertise. Elias made a point of deferring publicly to non-human specialists, reinforcing that leadership did not equate to dominance. The gesture did not go unnoticed, subtly shifting perceptions of human intent. When a lead finally emerged, pinpointing a likely rendezvous, the question became how to respond without triggering the very conflict they sought to prevent. Elias weighed options late into the cycle, aware that delay could be fatal. He chose a narrow path, authorizing a small joint delegation to approach the rendezvous openly rather than with force. It was a gamble rooted in the belief that exposure could disrupt manipulation more effectively than confrontation. Elias volunteered to accompany the team, knowing his presence would be scrutinized and possibly targeted. The decision drew concern from allies, some urging caution, others questioning the wisdom of risking a central mediator. Elias accepted their doubts without defensiveness, explaining that proof demanded personal stake. Humans had always bridged divides by stepping into uncertainty, and he would not ask others to do what he would not. Preparations were swift, the delegation departing under a tense hush. As their vessel slipped into transit, Elias felt the familiar blend of fear and resolve settle into something steadier. Whatever waited ahead, retreat would only embolden those who thrived on chaos. The rendezvous site was a graveyard of debris and derelict structures, silent and watchful. Elias sensed the delegation's collective tension, each member alert to the slightest anomaly. They broadcast their presence, unarmed and identifiable, a declaration of intent as much as location. The response came slowly, cautious signals probing rather than attacking. Contact was made, a fractured conversation unfolding through layers of mistrust. Elias took the lead, acknowledging the group's grievances without legitimizing their methods. He spoke of the cost of their actions, not in abstract terms, but in disrupted lives and endangered futures. The exchange was fraught, tempers flaring, yet Elias held his ground, refusing to escalate. He sensed hesitation on the other side, a crack in the posture of calculated indifference. The moment stretched, balanced on a knife edge. When the confrontation ended without violence, Elias felt the release ripple through the delegation. Agreements were tentative, provisional, but they marked a turning away from escalation. The nomadic group withdrew, their influence diminished by exposure rather than force. Elias knew the victory was incomplete, that such actors rarely vanished entirely. Yet the immediate threat receded, buying precious time for the system to solidify its new norms. As the delegation returned, word spread quickly, relief mingling with cautious hope. Elias sent a detailed report to the Empress, outlining the encounter and its implications. He did not frame it as a triumph, but as a demonstration of what restraint and transparency could achieve. Waiting for her response, he felt exhaustion settle deep, yet beneath it lay a quiet satisfaction. Humanity's proof had held under pressure, not through dominance, but through deliberate vulnerability. The Empress's reply arrived as the station lights dimmed into their rest cycle. Her words acknowledged the risk taken and the outcome achieved, noting that the system had weathered a test designed to fracture it. She warned that future trials would be harsher, adversaries more subtle, but conceded that humanity's approach had shifted expectations across multiple fronts. Elias read the message twice, absorbing its measured approval. He leaned back, allowing himself a rare moment of stillness. Outside the viewport, the stars burned steady, indifferent yet enduring. Elias understood that the decisive push was nearing, that the final measure of trust would demand even more. He did not know what shape it would take, only that he would face it as he had every test so far. With patience, the station woke to an unfamiliar quiet, not the tense stillness of fear but a measured calm that felt earned rather than imposed. Elias sensed it as he moved through the corridors, the absence of hurried glances and tightened postures speaking louder than any announcement. Messages flowed in with fewer qualifiers, fewer coded hesitations, and he took that as a sign the system had begun to trust itself again. He reviewed schedules and handovers, ensuring human crews continued their rotations without spectacle, reinforcing the idea that stability was a habit, not a performance. When he paused at a viewport, the stars seemed less accusatory, their cold light softened by the knowledge that choices had mattered here. He knew the decisive moment had not arrived with sirens or spectacle, but through accumulation, the slow accretion of restraint. Still, he felt a pull, an intuition that the final measure awaited, quiet and exacting. He breathed, grounded himself, and kept moving. The summons came as a private channel request bearing the Empress's seal, no urgency marker attached. Elias accepted at once, straightening instinctively as her image resolved. She appeared without armor again, seated before a field of softly shifting light that suggested no single location. Her gaze was direct, the fury that once burned there now tempered into something precise and assessing. She spoke first, naming the changes observed across the system, the way patterns of escalation had broken into pauses and questions. Elias listened, noting the absence of accusation, the careful choice of words. When she paused, he responded with measured candor, acknowledging the fragility of what had been achieved and the labor required to maintain it. He did not claim credit, instead emphasizing shared effort and the willingness of many to risk restraint. The Empress inclined her head slightly, a gesture that carried a weight Elias had learned to recognize. She told him the final measure would not be taken here, not in a place already primed for cooperation. Instead, she named a peripheral world, one overlooked by major routes, where a long-standing grievance had hardened into isolation. No council met there, no protocols softened interactions, and outside attention was rare. The Empress said plainly that if humanity could be trusted, it would be trusted there, where leverage was minimal and outcomes uncertain. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, followed by clarity. This was not a test designed to showcase power, but to reveal intent when no one was watching. He accepted without negotiation, understanding that refusal would echo louder than failure. The channel closed with a simple acknowledgement, leaving Elias alone with the shape of what came next. He prepared quietly, choosing a minimal team and a vessel configured for endurance rather than display. The journey to the peripheral world unfolded without incident, the stars sliding past in patient silence. Elias used the time to review historical fragments, piecing together the grievances that had driven the world inward. Trade disputes unresolved, cultural slights magnified by distance, a memory of being treated as a margin rather than a participant. He recognized the pattern with a pang of familiarity, thinking of regions on Earth that had retreated from global currents after being ignored too long. Humans had learned, sometimes too late, that neglect could wound as deeply as aggression. As the ship decelerated, Elias felt resolve settle into a steady readiness. He adjusted his approach, stripping language to essentials, preparing to listen longer than he spoke. The vessel emerged near the world, sensors reading minimal traffic and defensive systems set to passive watch. Elias requested permission to approach, then waited, unarmed and patient. The response came after a long delay, permission granted with conditions that limited access and movement. Elias accepted without comment, guiding the ship into a narrow docking bay that bore the marks of age and careful maintenance. The airlock opened to reveal representatives whose expressions carried suspicion honed by years of disappointment. Elias greeted them with a simple acknowledgement, offering no credentials beyond his name and purpose. He was escorted through corridors that felt deliberately plain, stripped of ornament, as if to deny visitors any illusion of grandeur. When they reached the meeting space, he noticed there was no elevated seat, no visual hierarchy to lean on. The choice felt intentional, a demand that words stand on their own. Elias sat when invited, hands visible, posture open. He waited for them to begin, honoring the boundary they had drawn. They spoke of history without embellishment, listing grievances in a cadence that suggested long rehearsal. Elias listened, resisting the urge to interrupt or contextualize, allowing the weight of their experience to settle fully. When he responded, he did not dispute their account, even where he knew it incomplete. Instead, he acknowledged the impact of neglect and the resentment it bred. He spoke of humanity's own peripheral histories, of places left behind by progress and the costs that lingered. The comparison was not offered as absolution, but as recognition. A shift occurred then, subtle but perceptible, as the representatives leaned forward rather than away. Questions followed, probing intent rather than defending positions. Elias answered plainly, outlining what humanity could offer and what it could not, refusing to promise outcomes beyond shared effort. The honesty felt risky, yet necessary, and he held to it. Negotiations stretched into extended cycles, marked by pauses where nothing happened at all. Elias remained present through them, declining to retreat to his ship, choosing instead to sit in shared spaces and wait. The choice was noticed, remarked upon in murmured exchanges he did not pretend not to hear. When talks resumed, the tone had softened, skepticism giving way to cautious curiosity. Elias proposed small, reversible steps, exchanges that could be undone if trust failed. The representatives debated among themselves, voices low but intense, and eventually agreed to one such step. The agreement was modest, almost anticlimactic, yet Elias felt its significance keenly. It was a bridge laid plank by plank, fragile but real. He documented the terms carefully, ensuring mutual understanding before anything was enacted. When the meeting ended, he thanked them without flourish and returned to his ship to wait. The first exchange proceeded without incident, then a second, each success reducing tension by degrees. Elias remained vigilant, aware that setbacks often followed progress. When a complication arose, a delay that threatened to reopen suspicion, he addressed it directly, sharing information rather than excuses. The transparency diffused blame before it could harden. Over time, routines emerged, expectations stabilizing into something like trust. Elias sent updates to the Empress sparingly, focusing on patterns rather than moments. He understood that the final measure would be judged not by speed, but by durability. When at last the representatives invited him to a communal observance, not a ceremony but a shared meal, he recognized the significance immediately. He attended without entourage, participating as instructed, accepting unfamiliar customs with respectful care. The meal passed without incident, marked by quiet conversation and an ease that felt newly possible. As preparations began for his departure, Elias felt the weight of completion settle gently rather than crash. The representatives thanked him in their way, without effusion, acknowledging effort rather than outcome. Elias responded in kind, emphasizing continuity and the role they would play in shaping what followed. When he boarded his ship, he paused at the threshold, taking in the unadorned space one last time. The world behind him remained cautious, but no longer closed. In transit back to the system, Elias reviewed the data, noting how small choices had compounded into meaningful change. He thought of the Empress, of her initial fury and the long arc that had followed. Humanity's proof had not been a single act, but a posture sustained across uncertainty. He felt pride tempered by humility. The balance he had learned was essential. The final debrief took place across a secure channel, the Empress listening as Elias recounted the peripheral world's slow opening. He spoke of restraint chosen when no advantage beckoned, of patience extended without audience. The Empress considered his words, then spoke with a gravity that stilled him. She declared the measure met, not because conflict had vanished, but because humanity had demonstrated a capacity to bear uncertainty without imposing will. She named the quality she had tested for, a concept from her culture that translated imperfectly as guardianship without ownership. Elias felt the phrase settle into him, recognizing its resonance. The Empress acknowledged that expectations across her domain had shifted, that humanity would be watched with a different lens. She ended the transmission with a simple statement of regard, neither praise nor command, and inclined her head.